back to the Movement Professional Podcast. I'm Dr. Chris Live. So today we're going to do another installment of Common Misconceptions. Last week we went over common misconceptions with core training. Today we'll talk about something similar in common misconceptions of posture. Posture is something that over the years there's really been quite a change in the narrative around the importance of posture. And it goes back to just kind of your mom or your parents telling you to sit up straight. And there's some deep-seated beliefs in how posture affects one's pain, function, and overall health. So what I want to talk about today is, from both sides of the equation, how there's some misconceptions on the value of posture. Some people really put a lot of stake in how important posture is in someone's well-being, and others, because of research that's come out that doesn't show a strong association between posture and pain, have totally kind of poo-pooed or neglected the notion as being meaningless. And I'm somewhere in the middle, and I'm going to try to describe these common misconceptions from that point of view. So the first misconception that I see quite a bit is the idea that bad posture causes pain, that it is the reason that one is having pain. And this is a reasonable misconception, because it's not uncommon that if you're actively in pain, you make a postural change and it can provide pain relief in the moment. That's different, however, than saying if somebody is sitting with slouched shoulders, forward head, if they have an accentuated arch in their back, they have some asymmetries in their hips, or they have a leg length discrepancy, that is the cause of one's pain. Pain is way more complex than that. And there's actually very, very little evidence in research when they look at these things, these postural characteristics, and looking at the severity of one's pain, the chronicity of one's pain. So research does not support that someone's posture is the cause of their pain or has an association to how severe their pain is. That doesn't make it not important, and especially in the world of pain. So one of the ways that I think it can be quite useful, and we just have to really look at how we define posture. We'll talk a little bit more about the idea of a best posture, or some type of posture that is optimal. But the idea of having someone who's actively in pain, or you yourself being actively in pain, and listening to that pain and making a postural change that improves the pain, I think is very, very valuable. It's just that the postural change that you make is not necessarily going to be the standard thing that you've been taught. Pulling the shoulders back, pulling the head back, there really isn't necessarily a best posture that you're going to go to every time to relieve your pain. That is a very specific process based on the individual. And I think that's what's really important there, is to look at somebody and say, oh, you're sitting slouched, that's going to lead to back problems. That's going to lead to neck problems. That is an overstatement, a big time overstatement. And one of the ways I like to look at it is how somebody rests, because a lot of times we are discussing these postural dysfunctions, if you want to call them, as somebody's static posture. So how somebody's sitting, or even how someone standing. How somebody rests is very unrelated to how well or how often someone moves. So if you're seeing somebody at rest and they're sitting slouched, you really don't know what they were just doing. You don't know, if they were sitting in a different posture about 5 minutes ago and then they're just taking this one on now. So postures are dynamic, and at some point in time, you're going to move through hopefully different postures, and that's why it's not useful to hold on to one posture as the posture you should be in. So if you look at somebody and they have some type of asymmetry, some type of curvature, or they're sitting shoulders or head forward, it tells you very little about them as a person. It tells you what they've been doing with their body, how they move, what their range of motion is. So it's not a good starting assessment. Now we can take that with other information as physical therapists or movement professionals. We can look at the idea of a starting static posture, and then as we add pieces to it, we look at range of motion, we look at movement, then maybe the static posture fits in our overall presentation. But on its own, it's a very poor association to anything that's very meaningful. Again, making postural changes, though, and teaching a patient or learning your own body and saying, okay, something hurts while I'm doing this for too long. I'm in this posture too long. Let me find another posture. That is very important. And that often gives one control over their pain. And that's an important job for a physical therapist or any movement professional that's working with pain, is to figure out the postural adjustments that make change for somebody when they're in pain. But again, it's not specific, or it is very person specific. It's not a general rule of thumb for that there's a right way to sit. So I think the old adage of, pull the shoulders back, sit up straight, I think we need to relax on that a little bit, but we can teach individuals how to listen to their body, make more adjustments to posture, move more frequently, as opposed to trying to find one static posture that is optimal. So that leads me to the number 2 misconception, is that there is a best posture. All right. So, and I think there's a couple things that create this confusion. Is oftentimes within movement practice, or when we're trying to lift something heavy or move in a way that we want to perform at an optimal level, there's a certain technique to that there might be a standard for. And this standard has a postural standard. It might be head over shoulders, over hips, that there's a general idea that the spine is being held as a unit, is moving as a unit, while we then move our hips and shoulders kind of independently from our trunk. So that, not necessarily a bad postural standard. I tend to promote that postural standard in a lot of ways, just because it creates a simplicity of saying, okay, let's keep the trunk in a certain position while we then, move from other areas. However, again, the problem with that is it also often promotes fear if there's this idea of a standard that also starts to creep into the consciousness of it's unhealthy to be outside of that standard. And I don't think those two things are the same. So when we're teaching movement, you can have a standard for technique, but that's very different than saying, if you veer from this standard, you are going to hurt yourself. You're going to break something. There's a purpose of the standard. And then there's also a purpose to relax the standard a little bit, depending on who the person is that's in front of you. So that's, number 1, that there is this best posture. Sometimes, again, we have to have some type of idea of where we're starting from, so that we can teach people to move in ways that they currently can't move, right? So oftentimes giving someone more options for movement is getting them to move better. So we start with something that we are observing. We see that, they don't connect the dots between the pelvis, the rib cage, and the head very well. Well, that's something we could teach. Sometimes people are so stiff in that area, we have to get them to move there, and we're a lot more lax on allowing some movement and some breakage of those rules. All right, so it really does depend on the person, but oftentimes I think that's where there's a lot of teaching from a starting point, a standard starting point, and then that carries over into everything, that you have to sit that way, you got to move that way, that there's no difference between if you're lifting a heavy barbell versus just getting up from a chair, right? So the posture can change depending on the demands. The other piece of it is to look at any one posture still causes a problem of being in one position too long. So oftentimes the bigger issue that I see when it comes to posture is that we tend to have lives where we do certain activities for longer than we do other activities. We lose variability in our movement. The most common example in our current society is we sit at a computer too long, right? And that leads to certain forces that pull us into different positions. All right. But the problem is not that the computer is pulling our head and shoulders forward, and we would be fine if we sat for the exact same amount of time with our shoulders back. It's just that we're sitting too damn long, right? And I don't want to vilify that. I mean, there's a purpose to it, and there's nothing wrong with sitting. It's just that if we were walking for 8 hours, we would get tired from walking. We're sitting for 8 hours, and we think of sitting as something that doesn't have any type of effect on our body because it's so it feels so restful. But in so many ways, it's just the strain of gravity is putting the same pressure on our body for a long period of time. So whether we're doing that in standing, we're doing that in sitting, we need variability. We need to change our position more frequently. And in many ways, we're rock stars at sitting. We can sit way longer than we can do almost any activity. but there is a too much of every activity. And many of us experience that too much when it comes to the static postures that we do most of the day, which sitting for many of us is the number one. But changing that to, okay, I'm going to stand all day doesn't necessarily make it better. Changing it to, I'm going to walk on a treadmill while I work doesn't necessarily make it better if there isn't enough variability. So all of them together, giving us more options for movement, makes it better. But any one change and just doing that consistently will still lead to consequences of overuse over time. All right. So I think it's helpful to think about posture in a continuum and postural endurance in a continuum, that some activities we can do much longer than others. And I think sitting is oftentimes one that we can all do much longer than we can do many other things. But there's still a point where it's too much. And how do we know it's too much? Well, our body tells us it's too much by giving us pain. And if we listen to the pain, then we will make the adjustment when the time comes. But oftentimes the task at hand doesn't allow us to make the adjustment in time. Or we get so sensitive to the pain that we can't even function now because we can't spend enough time in any one position without having to adjust to concentrate and do much of anything. So it's really important to early on not to think of it as we're finding a best posture, but that we're trying to give ourselves interval breaks from being in one position for too long. And then the other thing in the same line of thinking would be when we do vary our movement to try to counter the movement that we were just doing too much. So a prime example of that would be if we're sitting, there's about a 90-degree flexion in the hips. The knees are bent about 90 degrees. So if we're able to lie on our stomach, propped up on our forearms, and if that's not too much stress on areas of the back, that is a nice counterbalance. One, we've offloaded the spine in its relationship to gravity compared to sitting, and we've opened the hips in a near opposite direction. So that's just one example. But the more we can understand the different forces that are being applied to our body, we can look at different ways to counter that. So standing in some ways at the hips is a bit of a counter to sitting, but not from a gravitational load standpoint. So our hips open up and go into more extension when we stand, but gravity's still kind of working straight down on our spine and our joints in a very similar way that they were with sitting. So it's certainly better to get up and stand when we've been sitting for a while, but we might also want to get up, stand, swing the arms a little bit, maybe go for a little bit of a walk pace, right? As we walk, now we are more dynamic with our movements. There's more reciprocal nature, more rotation to our limbs. All of these things vary up the movement and in some ways create a little bit of a counter to what we were doing too much of. All right, so another thing that's really important in the job of a movement professional is to be able to understand biomechanics, not from a standpoint of making rules that promote fear, not saying like, if you do this, you're going to be hurt, but really having an understanding of what a counter is to the stress that somebody's doing too long. And how we communicate that is really important, to say that there's nothing that you're doing necessarily wrong. It's just your body's telling you you're doing it too long. What's the thing that would get you into a better situation as quickly as possible? Well, understanding biomechanics gives us a good starting point, but ultimately we can have the best knowledge of what the best counter force is to what somebody's doing too long, and it can hurt them in a different way. And we have to be able to adapt that. So we have to always be in a process-oriented mindset where we're looking at, the symptom will tell us what to do. And the symptom tends to get better when there's a shared decision-making process. So when we can show a patient or client that there is a way to change their pain that feels like it is unrelenting and constant, just by making some type of positional change. Once we can figure out that there is a way to change the pain, then we can have a discussion about how to set up the day so that the postural static postures don't get us into a point where we bring the symptom on as long. And then we also get a sense of how long that point in time is that we need to adjust our position, and how frequently do we need to adjust our position. That tells us how sensitive the symptom is in any one moment, but it could also show us progress over time. If we can sit for 5 minutes and every 5 minutes we have to get up and change position because pain starts, and we start to do that for a little bit, we have a program where we're changing our position more frequently, and eventually it takes 15 minutes before we have the onset of pain, even if the pain feels exactly the same, that is an absolute sign of progress. So we have to have some standards of looking at how long can we be in positions, but we have to have movement variability ready so that we can get out of these positions. And movement variability doesn't really involve just pulling ourselves into some imaginary best posture and staying there. That's going to just give us a problem. And maybe it's a different problem than what we were having, but it'll eventually be a problem of overuse in very much the same way. So the last misconception that I see is that posture is this static idea, the static position of, again, holding a posture that is somewhat optimal, somewhat militant, head over shoulders, over hips. There's nothing wrong with that terminology, and I use it quite a bit when it comes to, again, a postural standard, as I was talking about with movement technique. However, when you're looking at the idea of posture as a whole, it's not necessarily useful to think of it as this static positioning or just positions that are being held, because there'll be different postures that are involved with different movements. So you can think of posture is movement specific. It's also different in different portions of a movement. So if I'm getting up from a chair, I may cue postural thought processes different at the bottom of the seat versus at the top when I'm in standing. And I think it's important to understand that you'll have different cues depending on the intention of the action, right? So again, the standard for posture changes. So posture is much more of a dynamic concept than it is some type of static positioning. And the more we think of it as a static positioning, what tends to happen is it creates a higher tension idea around posture, is that we have to hold tight onto some position, which when you're in pain can create more pain, because more tension sometimes in the muscles and when the body is already sensitive can actually lead to more pain, but it certainly will create less endurance in action, because as we get tighter, we tend to get more rigid. We lose the natural flow of our body. So as we're moving, and let's just take walking as an example, there may be this essence of head over rib cage over pelvis. However, if we think of it as a holding of a static position, how do we also then move, right? So we have to have an understanding of how posture changes as we move through space. And I think that really becomes an important thing. What I tend to do practically is try to slow a movement down, deconstruct it into as many parts as possible. So we can start with this idea of static as things are slowed down, and just get a sense of where things are in relation to each other. Where's the head? Where's the rib cage? Where's the pelvis? Where's that in relation to your foot on the ground? And then get some type of references for that. But we also have to then be able to speed things up. And when we speed things up, the essence of what we were practicing slow should still be able to remain, but there needs to be different cueing, and eventually it needs to become a more unconscious or automatic process. All right. But so there, I think we have to broaden our definition of posture in many ways so that we look at it as a dynamic process as much as possible. And then the other piece of that, which I was alluding to, is that if we have just different intentions for the same action, so let's just use a squat as an example. If we're doing a heavy squat where there's a lot of load, we're going to have a completely different idea of how we want to create tension and how we want to hold our posture, because we get so much more feedback from the load. If we're off our positioning a little bit, not only may it be a little bit dangerous in that it'll shift load to maybe places that we don't feel so strong, but it also get us closer to being knocked on our ass or falling forward on our face. And then we'll have to create some type of response to that, which might not be optimal for what we're looking for. So the heavier the load is, the more tension that we're trying to create in our body to not get knocked out of desired posture. When the loads and the demands are low and the endurance element, we want to do things longer, we have to let the tension out, or we're just not going to be able to do it for longer. So when the idea of the intention of an action is to go longer, energy conservation takes precedent. So we may still have a general idea of, all right, I want to keep the head over the rib cage over the pelvis, but we're much less strict on if we go outside of that position. We may use momentum in different ways to try to help us with that. So again, this idea of some type of static and high tension nature when it comes to posture is going to be very not fruitful when we have to do things that incorporate longer endurance. And again, this is very common in the world of spinal pain, especially, is that it's not the movements that are under heavy load that tend to be the biggest problems. It's the movements or the static postures that are under light load done for longer periods of time that start to be the problem. Hopefully this conversation illuminated some things for the audience. If you have any questions, please reach out. I'd be happy to get back to you. I'll see you next time.